So, does anyone know what the prisoner's dilemma is? Just raise their hands. At least heard of it before. Alright. Okay. So, the prisoner's dilemma is like a social kind of game created in like the 1950s by two researchers. And it was basically, they were trying to look at the cooperation and basically the social aspect between two people. In this case, they were prisoners. So basically they said the game was you and your friend are both arrested for some sort of crime. You're not wrongly arrested, you just committed a crime. You're locked up in a jail cell by yourself, so you have no communication with your friend. And the police come to you and they basically say, okay, we're going to do this ultimatum. We're going to basically, you can talk to us or you can stay silent. And if you both talk, if you and your friend both talk, you both have to spend 3 months in jail. If you talk and your friend does not, you get to go free and your friend has to spend a full year in jail. And vice versa. So if you stay silent, your friend talks, you have to spend a year in jail and your friend goes free. Or if you both stay silent, you both serve a month in jail and then you go free. So the idea was to create this situation where you're either choosing to cooperate or defect, and depending on which option you chose, you potentially have a higher payoff, or you can basically walk away with nothing. So I'm going to talk about 3 papers today, kind of a modern day version of the prisoner's dilemma. So my first paper is Extortion Can Outperform Generosity in the Iterated Prisoner's Dilemma, or Selfish People Perform Better in the Prisoner's Dilemma over time. So obviously today you cannot just walk around to people and give them prison time. So they had to flip the model around, and basically instead of giving out a punishment for not choosing to cooperate, they were giving out a reward if you did cooperate, or a reward if you do defect. So in this case, if you and your friend both cooperate, you both are given $3 or 3 points. If one of you defects and the other person cooperates, whoever the defector was gets $5, and the person who cooperated gets nothing. And if you both defect, you both get $1. So it's the same kind of model as this, it's just flipped around. And they did a study with 8 different groups. So 4 of the groups played 500 rounds of the Prisoner's Dilemma. So they basically had to choose to cooperate or defect 500 times. The other 4 groups chose to cooperate or defect 60 times, so they put 60 rounds. And then in each of those amounts, 2 of the groups were aware that they were playing against a computer opponent, and 2 of the groups were unaware. So they found that the selfish players ended up making more money at the end of the game than players who cooperated when they were when they were unaware that they were playing against a computer. So basically, the idea was that if you're aware that you're playing against a computer, that you have less of a chance to walk away with more money. The computer's always going to have one step ahead of you. It's always going to be able to choose the best option for itself. And so they would more often than not choose to cooperate. So in graph A, or A up here, it's showing the round of 500 participants when they were aware they were playing against a computer. And the red bar is just showing this red bar here is showing the computer, and the empty bar is showing the human player. And this chart, so the red is when the computer was playing with an extortionate strategy. So basically it was using a predefined set of moves where it was trying to perform the best. And then the generous strategy was where the computer was doing a predefined set of moves where it was trying to play. It still was trying to win, but it was trying to be more generous, it was being more flexible. And in the case where the human was playing against the extortionate computer, over time, the computer does better. So you see here, in this case, where it's playing against the generous, the human participant is also performs better than, in this case, when the computer is being extortionate. And that seems obvious, right? If the computer is trying to be extortionate, its opponent is probably going to perform worse. But in this case, where they were unaware, the computer also performed worse, which means that the human had to have been playing selfishly. Because the only way for the computer score to go down is if the human is cooperating less. And then they came to the same conclusion with the 60 rounds, except the margin between the selfish, they weren't able to get the same margin because they found that it took more than 60 rounds for the humans to kind of adopt this selfish or cooperative behavior. So, does anyone have any questions with that? That's kind of confusing, a lot of information.
So let's, for example, just think about the genres.
Sure.
Which are on the top 500.
Okay.
So the one, so A is aware, right, and B is unaware.
Yes.
So in B, they think they're playing as a human.
Yes.
Okay. So how did they interpret, or maybe just re-explain, how did they interpret the shift in the human behavior?
So, when they were aware that they were playing against a computer, they chose to cooperate more. Because they figured it.
Do they know the results of the previous round when they make their decision the next round? Do they
Yes.
get feedback?
Yes. So they know what happened the previous round. They know the computer's previous move. And they know that for the unaware as well, but they just think it's a human who made that move.
So how does the computer know? How does the computer store?
Okay, so that is basically the researchers had the computers programmed to make a certain set of moves. So they said, okay, first move is to cooperate, second defect, third defect, fourth cooperate. And that was the same for all participants. And that had been shown in the past in different studies that if you did this set of moves, you were basically able to, over time, make it so that your opponent would choose to either cooperate or defend. No randomness in the computer set. It's a set pattern for all participants. Yes.
So the extortionist, to put it back to the listeners on it, we say the extortionist pattern would be they snitch.
Yes. They're trying to kind of.
Okay.
Basically, they're trying to maximize their own score while minimizing their opponent's score.
Okay. Instead
Whereas
of
the
trying to go
generous
for
does not. The generous is more so just trying to maximize your own score. Any other questions?
I understand it's hard to describe the algorithm in a
Yeah.
few words. Did they publish the algorithm the computer played for the generous?
Like the specific set of moves?
Yeah.
I don't believe in this paper. There were previous studies before that was kind of coming up with this set of moves. I can look into it and get back to you. Any other questions?
The humans perform better when they were unaware they were playing computer, right?
Yes.
So does that
They performed the same when they were playing against generous. They performed worse when they were when they were unaware.
so we don't have any conclusions yet on why?
Well, the researchers believe that it was because when they were unaware they were playing against a computer, they were more likely to cooperate. Okay. So my second paper is humans chose representatives who would force social cooperation in social dilemmas through extortion, or humans prefer selfish people to represent them in social dilemmas. So this is, again, kind of a modified version of the prisoner's dilemma. This is modified more so to create a sort of gradient between the decisions. So now instead of just simply cooperating or defecting, all the participants were given a certain amount of money. In this case, they were all given 40 euros. And they had to, as a group, raise a certain threshold of money, or else they had to give it all back. So there were 3 different groups of people. The first group of people were 6-player games. So there were 6 players participating in the game, and then there were 3 rounds, and I'll get to the 3 rounds in a moment. The second group of people were 18 players, so it's the same thing as the 6-player game, except now there are 18 players playing at once. And then the last group was, there are still 18 players, but they were divided up into groups of 3 players, and each group had to elect a representative, and basically whatever that representative chose to give, all of their group members, the other 2 group members, had to give that same amount. And basically the 3 different rounds is after each round, the participants in this group could choose to re-elect their representative. So the first game it was random. The second game they basically went to a group and they said, okay, we want this person to be our representative now. And then in the third game, after the second game, going into the third game, they did the exact same thing. And in the first 2 groups, it was just a way to kind of separate them and see that if over time they change their view.
Groups were independent, right? Like played 6 people first, and then 18 people, and then a representative.
Yes, so it was different people in each group, different set of people. Yeah. Okay, so in the chart at the top here, they're basically showing the number of selfish players per group. And the way they quantified a selfish player was if they gave less than their fair share or less than half of what they were given. So if all participants were given 40 euros, basically if a player gave less than 20 euros, they were considered to be selfish. And in order for all the participants to keep whatever money they had left over at the end of each round, they had to each give half of their sum. So in this case, they had to give 100. They had to raise around 180. No, sorry. They had to raise 120 euros. And so that's just showing in the graph that over time, the 6 players group, so out of all the rounds, the 6 players group had the least percent of selfish players. So in this case, it's around 37. So 37% of the players gave less than half of what they were given. It's a little bit higher for 18 players. It's around 42%. So 42% of all players gave less than half of what they were given. And then the 6 representatives is nearing about 50%. So almost half of the people in the representatives gave less than half of what they were given. And then the graph at the bottom is showing how much the participants made at the end of the study in each of the 3 rounds. And they also split it into players who were considered fair overall, so they gave more than half of what they were given altogether, or selfish, they were given less than half of what they were given altogether. So in the 6 players, the selfish players made the most money, whereas the generous players, the fair players, made considerably less money. And the 18 players and the 6 representatives group each made about the same between them. The selfish players were still making more though, which agrees with what was in the past study and agrees with what has been done in the past. The selfish players typically performed better. But the interesting thing that happened in this study was specifically in the 6 representatives group, when after the first game, which was random, the representatives for each group was chosen at random, players who were considered to be generous were tended to be voted out. So players who gave on average more than 55 euros tended to be voted out, whereas representatives who gave less than around 45 euros tended to stay in and continue playing. And that was only after game 1. But after game 2, they became almost equal. So now, the people who are being voted out and re-elected are given almost the exact same amount. At this point, it's not really a matter of whether or not they were selfish or not. And kind of a along those lines, if you figure more selfish people are going into the game, you'd figure, okay, the total amount of money that was raised would actually go down. But that's not what happened. They actually raised more money as more selfish players were coming into the game. So here, after game 1, when it was random, they made 105 euros per 6 players, so multiply that by 3 for the total amount. And that's less than they needed, so no one got any money for that game. After the second game, when more selfish players have been voted in, they reached their threshold, and they raised more money than the first game. So you don't have those generous players in the game anymore, or maybe some of them still are, maybe 1 or 2. But the majority of players in the game are now selfish per game 1, but they actually raised more money. And the same thing is true for game 3. And that was kind of the interesting takeaway from this one. Any questions?
What kind of communication goes on during the game? What are you allowed to do? Are you allowed to first offer less money and then more?
No, so they just had to say one amount that they were offering, and that was, yeah. Any other questions? The last paper is The Shadow of the Future Promotes Cooperation in a Repeated Prisoner's Dilemma for Children, or Children Choose to Cooperate More over Time in a Prisoner's Dilemma. So we're back to the original model of the Prisoner's Dilemma, where if you both choose to cooperate, you both make a certain amount of money. In this case, it was 3 points. If one of you chooses to cooperate, one of you chooses to defect, whoever cooperates gets nothing, and whoever defects gets 4 points. And if you both defect, you both get 1 point. And for children, to kind of make it even easier for them, they created just like a little game to play. So the kids could either choose to push or pull. If they push, they would be pushing 3 tokens to their opponent. If they pull, they'd be pulling 1 token to themselves. And then if they push, they'd be pushing 1 point into the gutter. Pull, they'd be pulling 3 points into the gutter. So just kind of a way to visualize it for the kids. And it was done in 5th and 6th graders. So they found that kids who, they also had 2 groups of participants. So all of the kids played 6 rounds of Prisoner's Dilemma. One of the groups was told that they would have a different opponent after each round. The other group of kids was told they were going to be playing against the same kid for 6 rounds. So they found that, in this first graph, that after the first round, kids who were told they would be playing against the same opponent for 5 more rounds chose to cooperate over 80% of the time. So over 80% of the time, kids chose to cooperate when they were told they were playing against the same opponent. And even if they were told they were not playing against the same opponent, they still chose to cooperate over 60% of the time. Overall, in the entire study, kids who told they were playing against the same person for 6 rounds chose to cooperate about 40% of the time, which was still higher than the kids who were told they were going to play 1 round, which is a little bit over 20%. And in this bottom graph here, it's just showing whenever their opponent chose to cooperate in the previous round. So the blue bar is showing when their opponent cooperated last round. The red bar is showing when their opponent defected the previous round. And then this down here, whether C or D, is whether or not they cooperated or whether they defected. So in this case, when their opponent cooperated, they were over 50% of the time they cooperated the next round themselves. Whereas if their opponent defected, they cooperated almost less than 10% of the time. And defection was around 50-50. So this means that when kids cooperate in a previous round, kids would then more likely to say, like, hey, he wants to cooperate, I'm going to cooperate this time. And just another interesting thing that they did in this study was, because they were little kids, they obviously had to get parents' approval, so they sent them a questionnaire. And on that questionnaire, they were able to identify whether or not kids had conduct problems. And the way they quantified this was they basically just had a bunch of different questions, a bunch of like social things, stuff at home, and they basically able to figure out whether or not kids would fall into the category of having a conduct problem. So they found that kids with conduct problems cooperated less often than those with low conduct problems. And then they also found that females cooperated around twice more often than men, which was another interesting thing. So, any questions from that? So, what is the big takeaway? If society rewards selfish behavior, we develop selfish tendencies. So, although selfishness has a stigma in society, people still tend to act selfishly. And people accept selfish behavior from others if it's beneficial to themselves. Lastly, as people develop, they become more likely to act selfishly than cooperate. Thank you.